But I do want to start so that I'm not keeping you longer than you need to be here. Actually, this is working. Okay. So welcome, everyone. It's been a little bit of time since our last one, which I think personally I was feeling good about, because I was thinking you've been, so many of you have been so good about attending so regularly and coming here after a long day, and especially as the weather gets warmer and we get into May and you maybe sort of kind of see an end in sight. I still think, wow, it's amazing that you're showing up. So thank you so much for showing up. But I was also happy that you had a little bit of a break from me, and then there'll be end in sight. I want to do switch the topic a little bit today, because I was thinking a lot about what we've talked about so far and our focus on conditions and our focus on this stuff. And I wanted to switch more to just implementation considerations and do something that's more focused on you, and maybe something that's a little bit more interactive than me just talking away here. So I am covering the same kind of content, but I'm going to do it a different way and talk more about implementation today than just simply going through the conditions. So if you've got that little poster in front of you about the topics, you'll note that this is not the title for that particular topic. And if you're that obsessed about stuff like that, man, you need today's topic so badly. Because we'll see. Well, you'll see. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit more about implementation and finding the kind of right balance in education. And then let me just make a lot of my incredible subtitle here. I really struggled. I was saying to people, I thought it was just corny. Are you educating human beings or human doings? And you'll see in my message today is that we focus a lot on doing and creating, in a sense, human doings, and that creates a problem, and we'll talk about that. And this won't be new to you, but it'll give you a language probably for what you're experiencing and a framework. So this is our topic today, finding the right balance, and that's really what it's all about. So we've got 3 questions I want to look at today. The 3 questions are, what makes the shift toward a stronger, why make the shift, between a stronger relationship-based, or why do it? We've talked about being kind of relationship-based as a concept, and those conditions are really the conditions of a healthy relationship-based approach. But I want to back up and ask, why do this at all? And then, why is it so difficult to make change in education? Those are sort of 2 questions, because one is, the second part is why toward being more relationship-based, but why is it so hard in education anyway? If you've worked in education for very long, you've probably seen a bit of a trend where initiatives happen and they kind of go for a while and fizzle out. And initiatives happen and they go for a while and they fizzle out, and again and again and again. And that change, real change, is really hard to make. And then the third question I want to look at is really practical. What might it look like for you to be more relationship-based in your work? Although I know I've talked to a number of you individually, and you've already really been playing with this stuff a lot in your work. So this isn't meant to be necessarily future. It might be what have you already done. So I want to kind of use this as the structure of what we're talking about today and say there's a kind of continuum. And one end of the continuum is relationship-based. And I want you to think about what the other end of the continuum is. So I have a bit of a task for you. And here's what I want you to do. And it's in line with what we do in education a lot. I'm going to give you 30 minutes. And I want you to take 10 minutes to do some reflective writing about your general goals. So just write free writing. This is going to take 30 minutes. And write about how you become more relationship-based as an educator. In that time, I want you to come up with 3 to 5 learning objectives, but I want you to place those learning objectives in order of priority and urgency. Make sure you got the short-term, long-term in order, like 1 to 5. And then for each learning objective, I want you to really think about 1 or 2 success criteria that clearly answers the question, how would you know if you accomplished those learning objectives? And then, after you've got those success criteria really explicit and clear, and I know you don't have a lot of time to do this, but we don't have a lot of time. I want you to establish a learning outcome for each of those objectives, and then I want you to develop a learning move for each of those. So in the end, you're going to have about 5 learning outcomes. You're going to have success criteria, you're gonna have learning objectives, success criteria, learning outcomes, and learning moves. I'd like you to do that now in 30 minutes.
You're joking, right?
Do you think I would ever ask you to do something like that?
I was ready not.
Yeah. Was there anybody in the room who was like, yes, yes, I want to do this. That's what I signed up for.
No, this is like work.
It was really hard for me to do that with a straight face. How about a third of the way through, I wanted to tell you that I couldn't even look at you in the eye. I had to read the thing. Was anybody, you can tell me, we're friends, was anybody like, no, this is good, like this is really right up my street. I want learning objectives, success criteria, learning outcomes, and success criteria. It was okay at the beginning, and then we got a little...
I like reflective writing. Yeah.
Reflective, okay, so if we had just done reflective writing, we would have been okay, but it was when I started to impose all that structure.
I'll be honest with you, as soon as you were done speaking, I was out the door.
Or you were at least thinking, how do I fake my way through this, eh? Like I'm gonna make my shopping list, and I'm gonna tell him it was success criteria and learning moves. Yeah, but doesn't this feel like two things? Doesn't it feel like the training that we can sometimes do at school board, saying, you know, let's bring you together, and I want you to do this. You've got a placemat, and you've got to create these things, and then you get to go back to your classes and try it, and they're going to come back in a month, and you're going to report on your success criteria. Doesn't that feel scarily familiar? And what happens, like I know you know this, and I know none of you do this, but if you feel this way about me saying this to you, what do our students feel when we say, all right, everyone, today we're going to do this, 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 and this, and you've just got that sinking feeling like, oh my God. I've said this before, my son, my youngest son, who's not a school guy, he goes to school every day with that sinking feeling like, oh my God. But you know, think about our students thinking, because if it doesn't seem to have meaning or purpose or relevance, or you don't own it, you didn't come here saying, I want to do that, I just impose a series of tasks on you, then you just think, ugh, like it just feels like a chore, and I just have to do this. But, and here, you know what I was going to do, but again, I'm not quite cruel enough person. I was going to conspire with one of you at the before the session to push back on me at this, and then I was going to accuse you of not being compliant or cooperative, committed to learning, and just the way we might do it to a student who pushes back and says, like, I can't believe it because I spent a lot of time on this. And this stuff's important, and isn't it important for you to have learning objectives, success criteria, learning outcomes, and learning moves?
In high schools, and you're planning on going to university?
Yeah, and you, like, yeah.
You better be ready.
If you want to be success in life, you need learning moves. I don't even know what that is. I went to university for 12 years, and I don't know what that is. Not that that's not good, but when it's imposed, it doesn't feel good. So I thought it would be fun to have like a little mini argument with someone, like on question, their commitment to their job, but I thought that's just too cruel. So I didn't need to do that to make my point, but my point is, how does this task feel to you? That's you with the heart pressure around your whole body. It just makes your blood pressure go up, or you just think about, how do I get out of this? How do I fake my way through it? How do I get out of the room? How do I just get the heck out of here? Poor little pug. I own 2 pugs, so they're important to me. So the opposite to relationship-based is task-based, because what I just did to you is give you a very task-based kind of assignment. I didn't ask you, I didn't consult you, I just said, here's what you've got to do, these tasks, and I gave you 30 minutes and to do those. So that would be purely task-based. And we can start to think that there's a kind of continuum in which on the one hand is relationship-based, on the other side is task-based. And that we probably all fall somewhere in this continuum and vary a little bit from day to day and year to year and what time the school year is, everything like that. And I'm in no way saying, remember the title of this is Finding the Right Balance. I'm not saying don't be task-based, and we'll talk about that. I'm saying ask yourself if the balance is right for you. If we look at the differences between these things, we can, the best way to think about this, the absolute best way, is the doing, being thing. That's a great, simple, powerful way. Being task-based is about doing, and being relationship-based is about being. Such a simple but profound kind of difference. You can spend a lot of time thinking about, are you doing or are you being? And when are you doing and when are you being? Task-based is sort of really the bread and butter of educators. You think about what educators, in fact, many people go into education because they're task-based. It's like lawyers go into law because they're argumentative. They are, and black and white. I used to try to teach mediation to lawyers. It's almost impossible. They just want to argue and fight and declare a winner. And whether they were like that and then went into the law or whether the law turned them into that, I don't know. But you could say the same thing for many educators. Very task-oriented. And this is sort of what we're taught to do. Because tasks are about figuring out what the expectations are and then meeting them. That's the bottom line of doing. So you're looking for learning deficits and filling in gaps. You're trying to get people to comply, right? Like you push against me with my 30-minute activity, I would be trying to force you to comply because I need you to get that task done. Extrinsic motivation, it wouldn't feel like an inherently appealing thing to do, that 30-minute thing. So I would try to motivate you somehow, it's extrinsically, by threats or maybe rewards. And really trying to crack the whip to get you to complete the task. The nice thing about being task-based is it's pretty clear what the goals can be because you can name them. And it's fast in the sense that, 30 minutes and you can get all your goals and objectives sorted out. And if you're really task-based in education, the goal is usually then to meet the standards, which is our curriculum. On the other side, though, you can see that there's the alternative to this, which we'll talk about as we go. But the upside is that it's very responsive to student needs. The downside is that it's messy and ambiguous and uncertain, the relationship-based approach. So for those of you who like the clarity of tasks and saying, okay, this is my list and I'm going to follow it, then it's hard to embrace a kind of relationship-based side of things. But we'll come back to this and we'll talk about it. So why be relationship-based? I apologize for all of this, but this pertains to you, so you'll see. Why be task-based, or why be relationship-based? Because tasks are about, being task-based is about having standards and expectations and trying to meet them. And that works fine when they're meetable, when they're achievable. But if you have too many, it creates stress. So let's look at some recent research on teacher stress. Look at this. 30 to 40% of educators leave the profession within the first 5 years of entering it. So over a third, depends on which study you look at, people abandon teaching in the first 5 years and never go back. 51% say they would leave if they could. If they had a viable career alternative, half say they would leave tomorrow. When you ask teachers what's the source of your stress, 79% say the workload is just too big. And then if you break that down into some more things, you look at that teachers report working 54 hours a week on average. You don't get paid for 54 hours a week. I think you probably know that. With 13 of those hours being outside of regular time, and they work during lunch breaks and other times when they're supposed to be on a break. And they also report, this is from this is Canadian research too, that curriculum outcomes are a big source of stress. All of the curriculum outcomes, new initiatives from the Ministry of Education, the school board, school administrators, and the individual needs of students are noted as the top sources of stress when they're asked to identify. And look at this, only about half of working hours are spent on tasks directly related to teaching. The other half is other stuff. Half of the sample reported using their designated prep time on non-teaching relevant job activities like committee work, and half the sample also reported feeling that prep time was allocated unfairly. So the prep time that often educators are given, they find themselves having to do other things and saying, well, then I've got to prep later. I've got to prep in the evening, or I've got to just prep on the fly. So here's another study that was done by a person in Newfoundland, but here's what they concluded. This is not good news. I'm sorry. Look at this. Overloaded and bombarded with massive changes and unrealistic time demands, these teachers were feeling overwhelmed, helpless, and powerless, exhausted and disillusioned. There was never enough time in their workday to accomplish everything that was expected of them. Their personal lives were eroded by the increasing demands of their job, which impacted their well-being, forcing many of them to reconsider their desire to continue teaching. That was the conclusion of this very large-scale Canadian report on the state of education for educators. Yikes. Yikes. That's serious stuff. If you think that's the conclusion, that's scary. When you think of how, and this is an academic report. This wasn't a union trying to advocate for teachers. This wasn't someone with an agenda. This was just a straight up piece of research on how educators are doing. So you think about when you're task-based and you have too many tasks to accomplish, that's the source of stress, this is the result. But let's look at the other piece of this. We know that stress is contagious. There's a concept called stress contagion. And it means if I'm stressed, you get stressed. And this was not very long ago, there was a piece of research in BC of BC educators, you might have heard about it, because it was a really neat piece of research, but they did saliva tests on 400 students to measure the stress hormone cortisol. And they found that when they measured teachers who had the highest rates of stress and burnout, that those students also had the highest rates of cortisol in their system. And if you took a stressed teacher and put them into a new class, so you could say, well, maybe it was the conditions that stressed everyone out, probably, but if you took a stressed teacher and put him or her in a new class where the cortisol rates were just normal, those cortisol rates went up when the teacher was stressed. So a stressed teacher makes stressed kids. We know that stressed students make a stressed we know it works the other way around too. You know that. I don't have to convince you of that. So the problem is that if educators are bombarded by expectations that cause them a lot of stress, there's no way that they'll be able to protect their students from that stress because it's not physiologically possible. So the students are going to feel that same stress. Stands to reason. And yet, we know from the preceding two slides that teachers feel an incredible amount of pressure to accomplish things that they can never accomplish, and they're chronically stressed. Let's look at this too. So these students then, many of them go on to college and universities. There was a very recent study in 2016, so that's why I chose this one, of 25,000 Canadian students. And here's what they found. Ontario, not just Canadian, Ontario. And look at this is not good news. 65% of students, so 65, reported overwhelming anxiety in their previous year, and this was up since 2013. So they're comparing the study from when they did it 3 years before. It was 57% in 2013, 65%. So 2/3 of students, not just anxiety, overwhelming anxiety. 46% said they were so depressed in the previous year it was difficult to function. So almost half, again, up in 3 years only 3 years. 13% had seriously considered suicide in the previous year, up from 10. 2.2 reported attempting suicide, up from 1.5. And 9% reported attempting suicide sometime in the past, not restricted to the last year. So that is some serious stuff when you think about what our students go on to experience. And I'm not suggesting this doesn't happen in our schools. This was just a really, really nice, comprehensive, big survey of Ontario students who happen to be those at college and universities. It certainly doesn't start at college and universities. It starts through elementary and secondary school. I'm not suggesting that this is all a function of education, and certainly not at all the fault of education, but I am saying you've got a situation where educators are reporting incredible stress and anxiety, And students are reporting incredible stress and anxiety. So you've got to wonder about the system and say, what's going on? When everybody involved is feeling super stressed. Definitely something's not working. So I want to contend that although there's lots of pieces, one of the biggest pieces is our emphasis on being task-based, on getting stuff accomplished, focusing on the curriculum, focusing on new initiatives, focusing on new instructional strategies, focusing on increasing, level 2s to level 3s, level 3s to level 4s, and on and on and on and on. That's all laudable, but I would argue, and you can say I'm wrong, that it's just too much. It's too much for educators to do. But let's just look at the continuum. So I'll tell you about the being mode in a second. But if we talk about the doing mode, and I want you to be asking yourself as I'm describing this, to what degree do you do this? And I'm not suggesting that you should never do it. I'm actually suggesting finding the balance. So right now, we'll talk in a minute, but I want you to ask yourself to what degree you do this. So doing mode is always setting goals and expectations, always having goals and expectations. So you have a daily plan with goals and expectations. You have all kinds of goals and expectations. Nothing wrong with that, but we'll see. Constantly striving, setting and striving to accomplish tasks. You're always thinking about what you need to do. Creating checklists. And you're constantly monitoring and evaluating because you're always asking, did I accomplish what I was supposed to accomplish? Am I where I need to be? Have I covered the curriculum documents? Oh my God, it's May. Oh my God, is everybody ready for the next grade level? Am I going to hear from the teacher from next year that my students aren't fully prepared for next year? And we compare our success to an ideal standard. Other people seem to be doing well. The school over there seems to be I heard it's good, but here it's bad. Or that other class is good. It's constantly comparing yourself to some sort of standard, some sort of ideal standard, right? Imagined standard. And along with that is comparing things to how they should be. Not how they are, but how they should be. I should be able to get all of this done. And feeling frustrated and stressed when we don't measure up. People worry about losing their jobs because they're not getting everything they're supposed to get done. And then when you have feelings, this is another piece of the doing mode. Your feelings, another variation on this, is feelings are labeled as good or bad. If you have good feelings, you should have more of it. Yeah, I should be more happy. And if you feel bad, you should get rid of it. If you feel guilty or lousy or depressed, how are you going to deal with your stress? Get rid of it. So it's another one of those weird things where you're supposed to do something always, even with feelings, you're supposed to do something. And as I said at the outset, this all works great if you have a job that has reasonable expectations and you can meet them. Then you can feel really good. You can say, I did a good job today. I met everything I was supposed to do. Now I can go home. There's nothing wrong with the doing mode if those expectations are meaningful and clear and reasonable. In fact, you have an incredible sense of accomplishment. Remember, too, this is true for you, but it's also true for your students. If the expectations are clear and reasonable and doable, they can feel really good when they go home at the end of the day. But if for them it's a struggle and hard and they don't have the support they need, and yet it's still doing mode, then they feel crappy, right? They feel like they're not measuring up. So let's look on the other side of this, the being mode. So I want you to ask, how much do you tend to be in doing? How much do you tend to be in being? Being mode, and these are sort of I've tried to make them so they kind of fit nicely. It's just focusing on the here and now, less on the expectations of what you're going to do and more on the here and now. You focus on direct, immediate, and connected experiences of the present. Just making a connection. The goal is to make a connection. It's not to get something accomplished, it's to make a connection. And you focus on connecting with the people around you. And you respond to the present, but you don't evaluate it or compare it with an expectation. You don't say, am I measuring up? Am I doing a good job? Is this right? Is this wrong? It's just the way it is. Again, I'm not saying, if there's those of you saying, I can't do the being mode, I'm not saying you have to always be like this. This is just the other side of the continuum, and the question is, how's your balance? letting go of specific goals or expectations, really letting go a lot of expectations. Accept the present situation without immediately assuming that it must be changed. And feelings, this is an interesting one. Feelings are events and information. If you feel down, you don't have to change it. It's just like, oh, I feel down. Okay, I wonder what's going on. And it doesn't have to be fixed or changed or altered. It's just how you feel. It's information about you. And uncomfortable feelings don't need to be gotten rid of. So there isn't this constant focus on trying to be happier and trying to be less stressed. It's just, I feel the way I feel. It's interesting because being mode often, especially in education, people say, yeah, but if all educators are in being mode, we would just hang out all day and get nothing done. But actually, that's actually not how being works. It leads to a much deeper engagement with people rather than an abandonment of any kind of ambition. It leads to deeper engagement. So this I know you already know, and I hope I'm not being too much of a downer here. This is important stuff. If you want to survive your career. If you don't, that's up to you. But obviously, so we see stress and anxiety, burnout are really big in education. It's in the top 3 professions of the highest rate of burnout. You're up there with paramedics. If you're doing, you can miss a lot of opportunities for what's going on because people are focused on the task rather than focused on the person. And I bet you've seen examples of this where someone can be quite upset or have real needs, but instead we got to get through this math worksheet, or we got to get this done. We got to get our task accomplished, so we ignore all the signs and symptoms that the students might have that they're not happy. I could have done that, for example, if I forced you, I would never do it. Forced you to do that 30-minute exercise, you'd be giving me all kinds of clues that you're not happy, but I would just ignore it and power through it. Like if I was really task-focused, I would just see that as extraneous information, and I would just keep shaming you into doing it. And you would, unfortunately for me, you're grown-ups, you'd push back hard. But if you're little ones, you wouldn't feel as powerful. And you'd find creative ways to push back. One of the things I want you to think about, and I'll talk about a little bit later, is one of the weird traps that we get into when we're doing is we think the way out of doing is more doing. If only I could do more, then I could get all the stuff I need to get accomplished done, and then, finally I could rest. We think that so often, and this is the instructional strategy trap, saying, oh, you have like a bunch of instructional strategies, but you're still not teaching math well. There's some you probably don't know. You need to read these books, and these books, and these books, and these books, and these books. And always trying to get more strategies, which is laudable, it's nice, but you can see it could be a trap where you always think there's a right way to do it, and if only you can find the right way. And then it becomes this more doing. It's just more doing. And here's the other thing that's fascinating. If someone like me suggests, it's lucky I have another job. Because if someone like me suggests, do less doing, it almost feels disloyal. Like I'm telling you, don't do your job. Or forget about it, or not care, or something like that. That's not at all what I'm saying. But to doing people, when you say don't do so much, it almost feels like you're undermining this collective sort of thing. Hey, we're all going to do here. And people can feel like they're on thin ice when they're starting to suggest that we do less and be more. It feels like you're telling people to give up, which you're not, or be disloyal to the kind of company agenda, which you're not. I'll talk about being in a second, but I've been yammering for a while, and you've been all listening. Any thoughts or reactions to this so far, or what you would add to it, or any reactions at all? And it might be that you have none, which is okay, but let me just check in with people and see what your thoughts are. Yes?
I'm an FSP,
Mm-hmm.
and I find that when I go into a situation and I don't know the students, and I haven't developed that relationship,
Mm-hmm.
nothing gets done.
Yeah, okay.
Pretty much nothing.
So you know, like the first thing, so if you're working with a student that you've never met before, you know, like you've got to put the time in to develop a relationship. Because if it's just about getting them to comply, which would be task, they'll never do it, eh? And you probably see that really clearly because of the nature of the student and the one-on-one nature of the work, that if you don't have the foundation of a relationship, nothing's happening. Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah. Yeah, you could see how if you were working with a student one-on-one for the first time and you thought, I'm just going to get them to comply, unless they're an incredibly meek student, which probably they wouldn't need an SSP then, they would push back like crazy and you'd never be able to succeed. And you probably see that with new SSPs or new educators when they're just pushing compliance rather than building a relationship. You can stand back and go, oh, don't do that. It's a bad idea. Yeah, that's a good point. Any other reactions or comments? We'll keep going, but I just want to check in. It gets better, don't worry. Okay, and we're done. No, it gets better. I went on a high note. Yes?
I am quite relationship-based person.
Right.
I'm teaching grade 6,
Mm-hmm.
which is EQAO,
Yes.
which is
Very, very task.
acquisition
Task
of
year, yes.
curriculum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you're right. So if you've got an EQAO year, it's super task time when EQA time comes, which obviously that's a long build up to the actual test. It's really right. In fact, I was going to include EQA in this, and I thought I'm not going to because there was some really interesting research about the teachers' reactions to preparing for the EQAO. But you can imagine it's incredibly stressful.
yes, but I have spent a lot of time this year talking to my students and listening to them, and we're just going to do what we can do, and then the test will be here, and then it'll be over.
Right, because you know,
There's nothing
how
more we can
stressed
do.
students get.
Oh,
if,
they are.
If they think that this is a be-all and end-all, they get super stressed. Yeah, yeah.
So we're working on it.
That's
but-
good. But it's a good example. Those years are really task-focused.
They are.
Yeah. You said a comment.
I'm teaching grade 5, and I know I have a lot of students with high anxiety. Today we were at the university for an active time playing
Active youth.
games, and even there, I had 4 incidents where I put on my social worker hat,
Mhm.
and they had to stop. They were stopping their activity. They wouldn't participate. They were breaking down because couldn't have that partner, or they were stressed that this was a new game that they didn't know.
Mhm.
And it's just not just in the classroom.
Yes.
I mean, it's easier in that situation to have the time to sit and talk with a student, and it's okay that they're missing out because somebody else is leading it. It's not my gym class, there's someone else that's leading the activity, so I can do that one-on-one with them.
Mhm.
But it's so difficult. Just yesterday, taking time out from a math session with students, and even though they were working in partners and they were engaged, I'm now leaving 25 students in my classroom to deal with one student who's
Mhm.
having this anxiety or whatever it may be that day.
Yeah. So.
So ongoing, and that itself,
Yeah.
I find is tiring. It's really drawing, and then it draws from your personal side as well, because then I start thinking, it's an attachment thing, I
Mhm.
guess, where now I'm leaving there being stressed out and burnt out, tired from the emotional end of it.
Mhm. Well, so when you describe that, what you describe, and it's in the educator stress literature in a big way, but I think is a really good point, which is that, and I know people know this, but when the focus is on succeeding at tasks, and I agree sort of what you're saying too, is this is a kind of cultural thing, it's a social thing, it's not just something that education made up, it's something that, that we do in North America. In fact, we could do this whole talk and just get rid of the word of educator and put in parent, because there's so many task-based parents who sign their kids up for a million things and want them to succeed at those million things. And the pressure on schools and educators for them to succeed is huge. Part of the research on stress in educators is the stress they feel from parents to ensure that students succeed. But the crazy cycle of this is, and what you describe is that you set these tasks for students to accomplish through the curriculum. they're too much to accomplish, and you don't have enough time, that causes stress and anxiety. You spend your time dealing with the stress and anxiety and not on the task, and that makes it even harder to accomplish the task. And you have less time to accomplish the academic side of things because the pressure to accomplish the academic side of things is creating a lot of anxiety, which means you got to attend to the anxiety. And so the gap gets larger and larger because we're feeling like we have to get this stuff done, and yet it's the very thing that undermines our ability to get things done because people feel such anxiety. Yeah, Colleen.
I was just thinking through that and thinking about my own preferences, and sometimes being really planned is comforting, I guess, for some people. And so it's kind of knowing your own self and what is kind of going to provide some comfort or less stress for you.
Yes.
And some people can kind of just fly with no planning, go into a classroom and just be able to do it, where other people need some comfort of a structure or plan going in.
Yeah, and I think what you're raising, Colleen, is my kind of point that this is a kind of continuum. You can plot yourself, we'll talk about this in a minute, on the continuum, and where you're at is, and where you want to be at is sort of up to you. The measure of whether you're at the right place is how stressed you are. So if you're doing it and you're in your comfort zone and it's working, perfect. But if you're feeling stressed, then that's a sign that that balance probably is out of whack. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could talk about, this is something I've been thinking about over the last couple of sessions, is when some of the most stressful situations is when I have somebody else teaching my class, whether it be a student teacher or I have an OPP kids program, so there's police officers comes in, or the worst situation when I'm not there with the supply teacher, but when you have almost to give away the relation, or you're there,
Yeah.
you're trying to keep the same expectation, but it's a person in front that has how relationship plays in, or what, I don't know, just I guess your thoughts on.
Well, I think, okay, so that question is an interesting one, and I think you've already partially answered it. The question being, like sort of what's going on there, and that seems to be inherently so difficult, but I think it's a perfect example of a lack of relationship. You've worked for months to have a good relationship with your students. You've got this relationship, and then someone comes in to do some teaching, whether it's a student teacher or a presenter, and there's no relationship. And you can maybe stay in the classroom and sort of have a kind of sort of relationship from the back, but you're not running the class then. So you are kind of handing that relationship over to the other person, and it demonstrates the power of the relationship because there's an absence of relationship there, and how things then become so frustrating because they don't have that foundational relationship. They probably don't have the time to develop it, so they just plow ahead. And I think then if you're watching that happen, it makes total sense that you're kind of cringing, going, I want to intervene because it's the relationship that's going to get us back on track here. And without it, we're going to be struggling to stay on track and not getting derailed. It just shows you the power of the relationship. Even when you just take one step back, it's not going to be, the students aren't going to feel like it's there anymore. And then they're going to react. Yeah, that makes sense. So you had a point
And a lot of the stress comes from the whole accountability thing. When you focus on tax-based things, they're quantifiable.
Yeah.
So you can have your marks list, your checklist, or whatever, and you have proof that, yeah, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. When your kids feel good,
Yeah, there's,
how do you prove that?
Right,
Show that.
yeah.
You say, this is what we've done.
Yeah. I like, so you're raising the question about, the accountability and how quantifiable things kind of trump those intangibles. I liked, some of you might have read the writer Alfie Kohn. He talks about, there's a lot of, he's an American writer, and he talks a lot about why people ask why schools in the United States aren't succeeding academically. And then he's been a real outspoken kind of guy who says, but we shouldn't be asking that. We should be asking why students aren't happier to be at school. And it's sort of simple, but it's meaningful, saying, if all we do is say, how can we just raise the grades, that won't be addressing the problem. But it's so much easier to measure grades than it is to measure happiness. And in fact, it's impossible to measure happiness. Once you measure happiness, you're turning it into something else. And so that's what happens in education, exactly what you say, is the quantifiable things become the most important things, and the intangible things are just nice, but but not as quantifiable.
They don't count.
They don't count. And when people try to quantify those intangible things, as I said, they actually corrupt it by turning it into something that you can't quantify, which again is happening with well-being. They're talking about competencies and how to measure well-being and measure competencies, but you can't really measure those things. You're going to turn them into something else because we believe that, yeah, it has to be measurable to make it count. And I'm not against measuring things. It's just when you have too many things to measure and you can't accomplish all those things. Because remember, like you said, if you've got tasks and they're accomplishable, no problem. It's just when there's too many tasks and the expectations are high and there's not enough resources and support, then you just feel like you're, like it's a losing battle.
Or you're dealing with multiple expectations. So you're dealing with the expectations of your principal, the expectations of your kids, the parents. Like there's a lot of
Right.
people to please in education. Right?
Yes.
If you're doing a good
Yeah.
job,
Yeah.
all three of those really have to be happy with what you're doing.
Right, and when you talk about expectations like that, in terms of all these different external expectations, what's lost in the mindset of education now is about who gets to set the expectations. And it's supposed to be the teacher who sets the expectations, who says, no, this is how we're doing this. And a parent is supposed to say, okay, you're the professional, I get that. But I think the mindset now is that there's so many expectations that are external that people are being held accountable to. Yeah.
I would argue as well, we put a lot of pressure on parents and parent engagement. And, I heard a parent recently who said, the book comes home every day. Not that that's a bad thing, but sometimes they don't have to do it. So they're almost making excuses for getting the younger sibling to read to the,
Right.
it was like
Yeah.
pressure on the family
Yeah.
when they're doing so many other things and there are other pressures on them. So it works, I guess what I'm saying, it works both ways.
Yeah, I think that pressure, as we said, is a sort of societal pressure where parents think that the way their kids are successful is that they get their homework completed and they give them they sign them up for all kinds of things and they accomplish a lot of tasks. So they feel pressure, then they impose that. They feel it, they expect that of the school expects that of themselves, and we all collectively are engaged in this process of being very task focused. The problem is you look at the stats of student anxiety and depression, and even suicide goes up and up and up all the time. So it is not just education, it's sort of society, but education bears the brunt of it because if you were just parenting alone, you could make some of your own decisions about your parenting alone, but you're parenting, so to speak, 30 kids for the day, and a lot of people are telling you how to do it and what you should do. Well, let's talk about being, because this is what I want you to be thinking about. You can't abandon doing, but can you move a notch into the world of being? So let's just talk about what being is. Being sounds in a very flaky way like inactivity, like just meditating and I'm just being, man. That's not that. It's not just inactivity. But we worry, as I already said, that if we're in being mode, then we just won't do anything because it sounds like you're just being. If you're in extreme being mode, sure, you wouldn't do anything. But it's being in an educational context. You're still an educator. There's an expectation. You have to educate. We're talking about being within that context. And we're talking about a balance, not abandoning doing. And being is more, it's not about not doing anything. It's asking yourself, does this make sense? Is it meaningful? Is it achievable? Is it relevant? Is this important? That's what stopping and reflecting and being is all about. And it also has lots, and we'll talk about this super soon too, has lots of implications for learning. Like not setting kids through a series of predetermined tasks, because that's task-based. And it's already been mentioned, it's more on what is qualitatively important. Being is qualitative, doing is quantitative. Being asks questions, is this meaningful? It's qualitative. Doing is, can I make, did we get it? Like, can we turn it into a goal, and can we measure whether or not we've succeeded? We need qualitative and quantitative in our lives, but the question is the balance there, that we focus sufficiently on the qualitative? So, how do you know if you're doing too much doing? So this is back actually to Colleen's point, saying your style is your style. Some people like to be more, and some people like to do more. There's no problem with that. You should be true to your style. The question is, though, whether or not it's causing you great stress. Then you're not really living in, with your style that's sort of, there's a problem. So if you ask yourself any of these questions, like if you feel overwhelmed by how much you have to accomplish, and many, many people do, many people feel overwhelmed. If you feel like you don't measure up to others, other people seem to have it together, but you don't. Or if you feel like some of the things you do are just pointless and meaningless, but you just have to do them. And if you are afraid that you're going to get in trouble because you're not getting everything done you're supposed to get done, and you're sort of looking over your shoulder and thinking, someone's going to get mad at me one of these days. And then, as I said, the idea, the doing trap, which is believing that, man, if I could get some more time in my day to get more done, I'd be good. If you experience any of these, it's probably a bit of a sign that you're doing too much doing and you're not doing enough being. That's really how you would know. So what I want you to think about is, and this is, I've just reproduced this on the little thing in front of you, is this isn't really quantifiable, but think where you're at in this continuum and where you want to be. Are you really task-based? Are you like an 8 out of 10? Are you a 9? Are you a 6? Are you happy with where you're at? Which is great if you are, but I want you to think about how much of this stuff do you do, and how much of this stuff do you do, and where you would plot yourself on that. You can either actually do that on the page or just do that in your head. It's up to you, because I'm not being task-based. Do whatever you want. And think about where you're at. Give yourself a kind of score out of 10. And then I want to ask you in a minute, what would it take, I'll come back to it, just to go one notch toward the being, if you feel like you are stressed and overwhelmed, what would it take just to go one notch? But I want to go back to another question that I raised at the beginning. Why is it so difficult to actually make change in education? Why can't we just say, yep, let's do it? There's a problem, we all recognize it, this is toxic, our students are struggling, teachers are leaving the profession, people are grumpy. Let's just get this sorted out, please. How come we don't just do that? Well, there's lots of reasons, but here's some. When you're in education, you're just meeting expectations and standards, and you're in survival mode. So I know lots of people who are just trying to get to the end of the year, and then they say, okay, and then this summer I'll do some thinking and learning and reading and reflecting. But of course the summer comes and it's like, I don't want to do that. Oh my God, I just want to not think or learn and reflect. I just need to recharge my batteries and come back in September. So people get into survival mode, so you can't make changes when you're in survival mode because you're in survival mode. Makes sense. And people also feel chronically inadequate, so they don't make changes, they personalize it. They see it as their own fault, not as something systemic. And they just feel badly and try to do better. And one of the ways, and we could get into this debate, and I want to be really careful, but if I'm saying, hey, you want to increase your math scores, the way you do that is you increase the number of minutes per day you teach math. That's really keeping up the pressure to keep up the pressure. That may not be talking about, it might be saying qualitatively, let's do math differently, but it might just be quantitatively, let's just throw more minutes at math and then we'll be okay. But that could be, depending upon how it's implemented, just about pressure. Pressure to create more pressure to get better math scores. Just pressure to succeed. And there's another interesting one that's going on, which is the pressure on educators to manage their classrooms and ensure students behaviorally, are good. One of the biggest sources of stress in those educator stress surveys is dealing with the behaviors of students. Because the behaviors of students are really extraordinarily complex and plentiful. You don't just have one in your classroom anymore, you have a whole bunch. But also there's real pressure to be on top of it and to fix it, and that you should be able to solve this. And you should find the right strategy so that it magically happens. So there's a lot of pressure then to manage behavior successfully too, like there's some sort of magic answer. And then there's always new instructional strategies and initiatives. My personal favorite right now is how well-being and math, the math came out at the same time. So in the Ministry of Education, they're going, could you do both of them at the same time, math and well-being? Why? Because they came out at the same time. Not because, and I know this from talking to people in the Student Achievement Office in Toronto, that it's just because, well, we have to accomplish both of these. Can we mush them together, please? Math and well-being. There's no logical reason why math and well-being should be mushed together. It's just that they both were, those decisions were made around about the same time. So man, we could check both of those off our list if we could just get them done. So they're new instructional strategies, but people are saying, well, what's the expectation? And as I already talked about, if you do a little less doing, it feels like giving up. You feel guilty if you're a doer. You feel like you're letting the team down. Anyone who's in doing mode thinks that you should always be doing. And so what happens is that they're, is what you probably know, is you're in doing mode until the end of the school year. But what you could also do is and I've seen this a ton of times in my 3 years here, I've seen so much of this. It's sort of what you probably would have done if I made you do this 30-minute thing early. You just become passive-aggressive, and you'd kind of fake your way through it. And then when it was reporting time, you'd make something up. Oh, yeah, it was good. Thank you, David. That was wonderful, and I learned a lot. And I put it on a chart, and we had a good discussion about it. And you're just making it up. And so you're complying. You're just simply complying. It's like the student who grudgingly sort of fills out the math worksheet that you've told them they have to finish in 10 minutes or else. They're not really thinking about math. They're just thinking, how do I get this task behind me? There's a lot of that sort of passive-aggressive, just meeting external expectations rather than any kind of innovation. Because, as I said, because just like my 30-minute task, it forces you to do something you don't want to, and so it's about just finding a way to appease me rather than saying, this is meaningful, this is exciting. So what I want you to think about, and this is another thing you can do in your head or you can write down, is if you were to move a notch toward being, first of all, you have to decide if you want to. If you're good, stay where you are. God bless you. You're right where you need to be. Wonderful. If you need to move, then I want you to ask yourself what you could do. There's a tendency, it's up there. There's a tendency for people to say, well, this is a systemic problem. We need our leaders to say this. We need this to change. We need that to change. We need this to change. That's all probably true. But that also puts you in a powerless position of waiting for people who have maybe more power than you to sort of say, you know what, let's stop with the task-based stuff so much. You have to, the only thing you've got is tweaking your own day rather than waiting for other people to tell you, hey, we're changing things, because you can't control that. All you have is your own little tiny world to control as best you can. And given the pressures on you, you probably can't go, I'm going to become a 1 out of 10 nice. It's just about moving to a little bit more of a kind of a human balance. So I was looking at the literature and looking a lot about what if we were more being focused in education, what would be the kinds of things, and these are just examples. There's two things that are important to remember. If you're being, then your big goal is just developing your students into human beings, human development. It's not shoveling the curriculum at them. The curriculum serves human development. You're turning them into functional, healthy adults. If you're doing, it's largely about, again, meeting expectations. So the ministry sets the expectations in terms of curriculum, and you meet those expectations, and then you check it off. It's not about human development. It's really about the sort of the certainty of saying, I covered the curriculum this year, job well done. Less about human development. So some of the kinds of things, but this is just to inspire your thinking. This isn't in any way comprehensive. In fact, I would really like to hear from all of you what you think might be a shift if we were being more than doing than we currently are. But certainly one would be a less structure throughout the day and just more exploration and spontaneity. When I think of being, I think of like JK and kindergarten. Like those are being places. Those kids, you can't get them to do much of anything, not even go to the bathroom. Like they're being. So you pretty well have to go with whatever's happening in the classroom because you can't make them comply. And there's something really wonderful about, I mean, I know it's chaotic and crazy, but there's also something really neat about that kind of education because those teachers are given permission to focus more on creating human beings and being rather than meeting curriculum. But as we talked before, things get deadly serious by the time you get to grade 1 in terms of meeting curricular expectations. So it might look just a little bit more like less plan and more spontaneity. I don't know if you do daily plans or what your daily plans look like, but a lot fewer goals. Like this is sort of what we're going to have a question that we're going to explore today. Again, this is assuming that you had the freedom to do this. And giving yourself permission. Many people do this either explicitly or implicitly, just say, I'm not covering that part of the curriculum. I'm just never going to get to it. I'm just not. So letting yourself totally do that and be okay with that, knowing that it's too much. A lot more student-directed learning than teacher-directed learning. What do you want to learn? And how do you want to explore this? Something that's talked lots and lots, especially in elementary. It's hard to do in secondary, but it would be nice too. Less division between subject areas. Not like we're going to do math and we're going to then do reading and then we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But that we, again, in a perfect world, more mushing together of subject areas with underlying goals rather than discrete sort of subject areas because there's so much overlap between those kinds of the underlying goals about learning to learn. Less emphasis on instructional strategies, more emphasis on student needs. Clear purpose and meaning to lessons. A lot of students, their big complaint is, why are we doing this? This is pointless. What's the point? What's the meaning of this? Now, I know that's common, and my students at university say the same thing to me, and I get grumpy with them when they do. So I'm not saying, that's always fine, and like they're always right, but there's some grain of truth in that. Long-term goals, multi-year goals rather than short ones. And an emphasis on effort rather than outcome in students. And that here's a good one and a tricky one. A greater acceptance that some students may just not excel in some areas. They just might not ever be good in that area. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that you don't have high expectations for them. You have realistic expectations. Their brain may not be built to do that thing. If we wanted to make every kid a great baseball player and we were certain that that was our job, we would find that that was a very hard job. Some kids naturally are good at baseball. Some kids don't see the point of baseball. Some kids aren't very coordinated and think baseball's dumb, and some are just born to play baseball. That's how human beings work. Some excel in some areas, some don't. It's not that we don't want them to be competent in those areas, but we recognize that there's a lot of variation in terms of what people's capabilities are. And that it's not about giving up on their potential, it's about recognizing their potential. This is it. Because if you focus too much on being a great baseball player, they might be a fantastic cricket player, that's almost the same as baseball, a fantastic soccer player, and yet you spend so much time on baseball, they might not even ever kick a ball. And less imposed teacher training. I know there's been less and less, but less imposed teacher training, because unless it's really clear about what the point of it is. Fewer committees and fewer overall expectations on educators. Greater acceptance that students get squirrely and weird in class, and that's okay, and that you don't always have to manage student behavior perfectly. And then big, deeper conversations about what's really important and what. In what we're teaching and why are we teaching what we're teaching. That's some thoughts, but what do you think for you, or for not you, for your friend, would be a step toward more like relationship-based and away from task-based? Because this is just from my perspective, but what about from your perspective? And maybe it's something you already did. I'm not suggesting that it's something you should do. Maybe it's something you already did and thought, yeah, this helped me move away from being focused on expectations and more toward relationships. Yeah.
I was just going to comment on one of the points that the greater acceptance that some students may not excel.
Yeah.
With the greater EQAO, and we've got the Student Success Project through the ministry, there's reporting that has to be done. On the initial assessments that student has to be projected to improve.
Right,
We
right.
tried putting numbers in that were realistic a
Mhm.
couple of years ago.
Mhm.
The
And they
ministry
just
sent
push
it
them
back
back,
and
eh?
wouldn't accept it and said we had to say they remove.
Mm.
So it's, you know, you can look at your kids and you just know what you can do with them, but then there's always somebody above there saying, no, you gotta
Yeah.
go that little bit farther. So there's that extrinsic pressure again,
Mhm.
it's back to the doing part.
Well, and it also suggests to me then, like if that's me and I know that I have to do this because it's an exercise that I'm being forced to do, but I know that it's not always realistic, then I'm going to kind of go through the motions and then become cynical about these projects because they don't fit my experience. They're imposed and they don't fit my students or my experience, and so I'm going to be cynical about it and say, all right, I'll do this if you want me to, but I can't believe in it because it doesn't fit with my experience.
And
Yeah.
then when the feedback comes back after EQA has been written and our marks are in alignment with what we projected, thought,
Yeah.
then we're having to justify why they didn't meet.
Right. Then it's your fault. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, we weren't allowed to have that.
Right. Yeah, and there you go. It's a perfect example of what we're talking about. This weird way of thinking where we have to have we have expectations that aren't achievable, and yet we have to set them. And then when we don't accomplish them, the educator is made to feel responsible for that.
Huge pressure.
Yeah. That's it. And you talk about stress and hurting morale. You know, you just feel like, well, nobody's really listening to me, and now I'm kind of getting in trouble because I didn't move the students as far along as I sort of promised. I was forced to promise. Yeah, those are good points. You were going to say.
I was just thinking, when I was looking at that list, one of the things with inquiry-based learning being more talked about and more, you know, we're given the opportunity that you don't have to have that quiet classroom when the
Yeah.
kid walks in, and you know, you have that, and especially in full-day kindergarten, it's really play and inquiry are being encouraged, as you said. That I did some of my latest lessons that seem to be going well are the ones where I'm naming the learning versus the one giving the learning, right? And so that's the whole idea, though. You're waiting for your kids to react, seeing what they're coming up with, and then you're saying, well, what you're saying is this. You tend to react more than you're saying, this is what you must know, and this is what you're going to do when they come back. So that's what I was just thinking.
Yeah, I
Looking
think-
at your list is very similar to what
Yeah, I think you're right. Inquiry-based learning would meet more of the criteria of more on the being mode. But in fact, when there's criticisms against inquiry-based learning, it's because it's too being and not enough doing. There has to be, like you're doing, some interpretation, some structure, some expectation for students. If it's all just, hey, see what you come up with. It sounds lovely on paper, but it's not very successful as a sort of pedagogical strategy because people do that and students don't necessarily. Some students that works, but other students, you need structure and some explicit instruction and dot connecting for students like you're describing. So I think that just makes, again, about finding that right balance, because sometimes the pushback is to go too far one way, like the inquiry-based way. But I think it's generally a good strategy because it liberates teachers to be a little less fixated on being so focused on expectations and structure. Yes.
I find that it's the mindset of the educators themselves, because I teach cooperative education, which is a perfect example of being, but sometimes the other, I don't want to say older generation, but the ones that were there before give you the thing that you're letting all the standards go to, like, they're gone, and there's no standards anymore. So it's just the mindset of the educator
Yeah.
being able to accept, okay, well, they are developing, but if they haven't learned how to do this, and this, or they haven't demonstrated in written form, as opposed to maybe demonstrating it physically, but it's not written down, so how are you going to prove it?
Yeah, and I think your point that people say, like, you're letting go of standards and then you're letting go of the quality of education, it's challenging to find a good response to that without saying, let's talk about the importance of human development. And, because that's where people stay in doing mode, because it sounds like that's the most responsible thing to do is to have standards and to meet them. And if you don't do that, somehow you're being irresponsible. And I think why it's important to talk about maybe task-based versus relationship-based, and how relationships really help students, truly learn and learn the things that are important. And if you're relationship-based, you know your student and you know what their struggles are. You don't need an instructional strategy to tell you. You know from knowing them. Then I think that helps. But I think I still think it's always hard because doing always seems to be appealing, especially in a context that is so doing sort of focused. And I do think that we can be our own worst enemies. We can expect people to do more. And without ever having that explicit conversation, we just run a session on more effective teaching strategies. That's just a doing session. That's just perpetuating, stress. Any other? Yes.
The problem is I think we're always looking at empirical data. We're always looking at best practices. Well, how do you get those numbers?
Yeah.
Those numbers come out of something objective. It's measurable. It's observable and stuff like that. And in a being, I mean, we can't measure in the same way. Do we know they make gains? Do we know they're developing? Yeah, but you can't.
You're right. You can't
Measure it.
You can't measure if a student feels safe, if they feel cared about, if they feel happy in the classroom, if they feel like you can't, and you just can't. That's the thing. You can't say those are hard to measure. You can't measure them. And so we.
But do we see it?
Yeah, you can feel it. The student can feel it, and you can feel it. I can feel it when I go into a classroom. Never mind. And this sort of goes back, and I know that this is, I don't want people to be depressed at the end of this, but it's only the educators who actually can say that, and we pay educators, quite a bit of money to let them determine that and state that. So we should let them do that, as opposed to saying, no, your opinion doesn't count. Let's have a test and see how people do. But I think often it's because we don't have an alternative to the task-based to say, yeah, but we have to do this too. So that's why I think something like relationship-based is useful, because right now, a lot of the ministry consultants are saying it's all about relationships, it's all about relationships. But the conversation stops there. So we have to say, okay, then what competes with relationships? What competes with relationships is tasks. Tasks and expectations and unrealistic pressures, that actually competes with relationships. And I think that's where that kind of juxtaposition is powerful, because there's been a kind of an attitude which is, well, we can have both. We can have impossible expectations, and all we need to do is have better relationships and we can meet those expectations. And you say, no, that actually undermines relationships. And it undermines successful teaching, because you focus on the task rather than the student. And then you won't know the student's true needs.
I think it's hard when you're in a classroom and there's teaching partners. So there's a ECE and a teacher, or an SSP and a teacher, and the teacher's saying that student needs to be at the carpet, and the EA's mindset is, well, they're listening from their dad.
Yeah.
And you lock horns,
Yeah.
and you totally come at the task, differently.
Right.
To me, I think the child is,
Yeah, that's right.
following
Yeah.
instructions by sitting at the desk, not running around the room, but that teacher feels they need to be sitting in that spot at the carpet, right? So
Yeah.
what do you do in that situation?
Yeah,
difficult.
that's a great little vignette, a great example of the teacher deciding that you have to sit at the carpet, and that's the success that the success criteria that every student has to meet. And it's like, well, no, actually, like listening and learning is what you really want, and it may be at the carpet, it may not be at the carpet. And that's a hard conversation to have, you're right, with someone who's very focused on tasks.
And it's interesting because like this one boy that we worked with last year, he was off the wall all year. The teacher this year, she's chill, though. He doesn't have to be at the carpet, he just has to be paying attention.
Yeah.
And that child is having a remarkable year compared to last year. Then last year the teacher decided, well, maybe if he sat on a bouncy ball, and maybe if he at the carpet, and the classroom was chaos. This year. Yeah. Because then it's not about, and I think many people probably have a variation on that experience where something was such a big deal and caused such problems for that student with a different person, where that wasn't the absolute non-negotiable task. You let go of that, and it's not a fight anymore. And most importantly, as you know, that
that student isn't made to feel like a bad person because they're not complying. For me, it really is a variation on like me making you do that 30-minute exercise, you not complying, and me blaming you for not complying because it's important. How dare you think it's not important? I could like generate all kinds of dysfunctional behavior in you because you'd be forced to do something you really don't want to do, and then I can blame you for it. And that's not to say that that's why all students have behavioral problems, but some of those things are negotiable, and we could cut each other some slack and we wouldn't have to fight every battle, for sure. And again, it really causes stress on the educator because they think they've got to get everybody perfectly around the carpet. And that's what a good classroom looks like. Everybody's in a neat little circle, rather than asking yourself, well, what really matters? Are there any other things that for you or in your experience are a notch toward the being? Again, I'm not looking for anything, but I'm curious about a notch toward the being.
David, what's working in high schools really well are the alternative education options for students who can't finish a credit within the 5 months it's dictated in the semester system. So a credit that can be begun, let's just say September 15th and maybe of 2017, and maybe won't be finished until December 2nd of 2018.
Right.
Because of the option of revisiting those lessons on his or her timeline.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's certainly not my idea, but we're seeing more of that as options in high school, and it's working for a lot of kids. So time
Yeah.
to do clear long-term goals.
Yeah, and it's a good example there of how we get locked into, like a semester system and think, well, everything has to be completed by that semester, where that's just sort of a random set of dates that we decided.
Alternatively, some students with certain courses can finish them in much less than 5 months.
Right, yeah.
So that meets their needs as well.
You're right, it works the other way around too. Someone might be able to finish that credit much more quickly, and in an ideal world, we'd have the flexibility so that they could do that. Whether because they're progressing really well, or maybe because it's not their favorite thing and they want to get it over with, but either way, we get locked into those sort of dates, and it's quite liberating when, hey, we don't have to do it that way. I know that, there's a lot of structure required and it creates problems when we start messing with the rules too much, but that's a really good example. Any other things that leap to mind? I'm watching the time, don't worry, we're going to wrap it up very shortly. But, yes.
The combined learning, the teacher I'm working with this year, she did something really neat. I thought, I was working with a student, and we were planting herbs for, just to have for healthy options and something part of her day. And she combined that, we bought pots and the kids decorated the pots, but she gave them a job to make a bag that the pot would fit in. And they had to figure that out, and they had to plan that themselves, and they came back and did their own revisions. And she incorporated, they were doing surface area, volume, and all that kind of stuff. And they were able to decorate their bag at the end once it's totally completed. And it was really neat to see it kind of combined. And
That's a good idea.
worked.
Yeah,
the
that's
kids
cool.
had a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, so it really is, a lot less structure. I mean, some large learning goals, but exactly when they happen and how they happen, you can let it be kind of spontaneous.
Completed it quicker than others, and then she, they kept,
Yeah.
they've had a lot of time to do it, and they kept going back and revisiting it, and it was really worked
That's
out
cool.
well.
That's cool. So I'll wrap up here. And you think about, really, ideally, the goal is to, if we think about make it more effective, more meaningful, healthier, and less stressful for both students and educators, and really focus on human development and focusing between a better balance. It seems like by the research that, even, as I said, with that one about college and university students, that that balance between task-centered and relationship-based has gotten more task-centered even in the last handful of years in education. So it's always been a pretty task-based discipline, but it seems to be not just in education, but socially, those, that seems to be moving more and more and more always to task. Expectations, and asking yourself, are you measuring up? Are you measuring up? Are you measuring up? Are you successful? You won't be successful unless you, acquire these skills and measure up. That seems to be just growing more and more even in the last 3 years. Remember, like I said, the tricky part is when you're task-based, the solution always seems to be completing more tasks. You're in a kind of box, a paradigm. You think, oh, don't give me this, tell me what I need to do. Tell me the strategies, just give me the strategies. But that's just setting you up for being more task-based. But it's really about thinking and acting differently and making a little change incrementally toward being more relationship-based, to being more being rather than doing. That's, for me, the best way to just think about it, is being rather than doing. So I would just reiterate, as you're reflecting on this and thinking about your own practice, think about how can you bring a little bit more being into your classroom and into your life. Because all of the research shows that people are happier when they have more being as opposed to doing in their lives and in their practice. So I'll just go back to this question then. Ask yourself, what do you really want to be doing? And what might you be doing? Are you making human beings or human doings? And are you, to what degree are you collaborating in this crazy social kind of nutty expectation that is really creating human doings when we want our little people to grow up to be human beings? So think about some small changes you can make, and I'd be really happy and interested in hearing about them. But that's it. It's like almost 5:30, so let's, yes.
You're from the world of post-secondary.
Yes.
Are these changes happening in post-secondary, or is it?
We're not even talking about them. It's interesting because, so question about post-secondary, because there's two things happening. There's the recognition that mental health problems among students in post-secondary is getting higher and higher and higher. But academics within post-secondary don't feel like it's their responsibility to worry about that. The division between academics and everyone else in post-secondary is huge. So it's like secondary educators times 10, saying, I teach my class, I cover my content, you come to my class or you don't, I'm only responsible for my content. If it creates anxiety or stress, go see someone. So no, I'm sad to say that elementary schools and secondary schools are miles ahead of universities. Colleges are better than universities, but universities is very much, we're context. I have students 3 hours a week, and all I care about is what I'm teaching them for 3 hours a week. That really hasn't made it to universities yet. And I won't go on, but people with PhDs who are academics aren't the most, I don't know if you noticed, they're not the most touchy-feely people in the world. So they're not really into relationships. They're into content. Yeah, and so it's going to be some time before that moves. And I think that's why elementary and secondary educators lead the way in that, because college is next and university educators are far behind that.